in there. So we're going to go live and we're going to say quote tweet, quote, paste this text in, and then we'll pin it and we'll get into, yeah, there, perfect. Okay, pin to profile. Okay, we're done. We're ready to go. All right, Elena, here we go. Now, we are doing so we already did the philosophy of mind with the group of people that were going through the other 101 stuff. However, we failed to record it. And now we have an extra special guest student involved in this, and we are going much more in depth. And I'm really enjoying this. We haven't even made it through probably a third of the first essay. We've done it such in depth, and we're not going to speed it along. We're going to take whatever time it takes to get through this at the pace that we're doing because we're getting a lot out of it. So what we're going to do today is we did the intro, we did the first couple pages of this David Hume. We're now going to look at further at this David Hume perspective, picking up where we left off. Let me turn on a. I should turn this on earlier. Let me turn on this light. See if that helps me read a little easier. It doesn't want to turn on. That's unfortunate. Okay. Well, it's bright enough. All right. So let's continue reading. Thus, the controversy concerning identity is not merely a dispute of words. For when we attribute identity, in any proper sense, to variable or interrupted objects, our mistake is not confined to the expression, but is commonly attended with a fiction, either of something invariable and uninterrupted, or of something mysterious and inexplicable, or at least with a propensity to such fictions. What will suffice to prove all right, so one of the things so when we get into the philosophy of mind, it's right up the alley of your research projects and your interest. We're going to be looking at AI. We're going to look at reductionism. We're going to be looking at all sorts of theories, emergences. We're going to look at all sorts of ideas, and we're going to ask questions. Is it possible to have AI in the first place? And are there materialist challenges to the materialist perspective from studying the mind? It's going to be great. Right now, we're micro focusing on sort of two things: one, the mind body problem, and two, defining identity, which is all a part of that. It's important to take a brief moment and say, well, wait a minute. In lots of other realms of discourse, we have all sorts of words that don't seem to be used here very often: soul and spirit. And we're going to, it's like, okay, so how are these philosophers approaching this? What I would say is mind is an umbrella term in philosophy, and consciousness. So here's what mind might mean in the mouth of a specific philosopher. It might mean spirit. It might not mean spirit, but it might mean soul. It might not mean soul, but it might mean consciousness or mental activities that are that are manifest. It might not mean that. It might mean something like consciousness or things that are defined as the doings of a brain, right? Like so depending on the perspective, let's say the philosophers are sort of arguing about what exactly mind is, and so it's an umbrella term that incorporates camps of people that have different perspectives on what it is that constitutes humans. So I wanted to make that point. I was thinking about that earlier. um what was the other thing to say here? Oh, okay. So far with David Hume, what we are seeing is he thinks that we're all making a big mistake about our own identities. He thinks we think our identities never stop existing, like they don't pop out of and into existence. We think it's invariable and consistent and maybe eternal or mysterious or something like that. Like there's this quality of this thing. And he's been arguing from, remember, his perspective is that you only know things if ultimately you know them through the senses. But this mind that you think you have, this I, capital single letter I, that you think you are, it is the thing that experiences the things, right? So, have you ever had an experience of the thing that creates the experience or that has the experiences? By definition, maybe you can't. And if so, he denies that there's any reason to say that there is such a thing. So he's going to say, for my part, maybe it's true of other people, but for my part, I think of myself as something that stops existing when I go into deep sleep, perhaps. And it's it's not really the same. All I see is a series of perceptions. So the I that I know exists is nothing more than the feeling of something hot at a certain moment. And there's another I that I know exists, which is the feeling of something cold at a different moment. But the idea that that's the same thing, that it exists between those two events, if they're separated by any amount of time, he denies all of that because he only wants to affirm things that he can know through the senses ultimately. So for right now, we're discussing this idea of identity, and that's his way of approaching it.
May I,
We're going to see very, very different perspectives soon,
may
but
I
let's,
ask something?
yeah, please.
So, does if Hume considers that there is an I, maybe there is an I that experiences the hot or the cold, is that the moment that he accepts as possible existence of an I experiencing the hot or the cold?
No, no, I think it's almost like he's saying you are nothing more than just that experience. That perception alone is all that you know of yourself, that there isn't a thing. Why posit a thing that has that experience if right before the experience and right after it, you have no evidence of it? All you have is a series of
We have
perceptions.
exactly, that's what I was thinking about the continuity of the existence of the I, because at one moment we have the experience of cold, on the other moment we have the experience of hot, but in between, the continuity of the I is experiencing the absence of these two triggers or whatever else. So
There are going to be thinkers who are going to argue along the lines that you're thinking. And David Hume is he has a rare perspective, right? His is not really like a majority view or anything. It's pretty hard to be David Hume, I think, actually. And it's impressive what he commits to. Um, there will be people who will make the argument like, okay, I can have an experience of hot as a thing that remembers an experience of cold that I'm not having right now, or a previous experience of hot. Like, there's gonna be ways of maybe trying to find some evidence that there's a continual me, right? My first experience of hot is different than my 2000th experience of hot, and whatever's having that experience is if that had been my first experience, the 2000th one, it would have been a different kind of an experience, right? So there are definitely going to be people who are going to argue in exactly that way and along those lines, and some who are going to argue in different ways that the conclusions of Hume are not to be accepted. But David Hume is not considering. So David Hume, it seems to me, has a commitment to not affirm as true anything that can't be traced back to the senses. All right, hold on, let me see this. Okay, so that's not what he thinks when he examines himself, that there's a self. He sees no self. All he sees are the perceptions and nothing beyond that. So do you have another question? Does that answer the question? Doesn't really. Does it point in the direction of at least I comprehended the question?
there is an I wonder if he accepts or not, and how can it be to not accept the I cannot grasp how he cannot accept the continuity of the self, whether it is experiencing or not. Hopefully, I will understand as we further read his essays. Now, the other question, and I hope it doesn't take much of your time, is
Good.
Hume, could he be a bit, could he have a Socratic devotion to his philosophy?
That's an interesting idea. So he's pretty devoted. I mean, he's going places that other minds might have been too weak to go. It doesn't mean that he's correct. It's just he's really impressive in a sense, in that sense. Um, we remember that Socrates thought that you can't have definitional knowledge of the types of things he thought were worth knowing. And I like the way you ended the last class by bringing up this question of David Hume. It's almost as if David Hume is saying, I'm in the cave. There's no out of the cave. The shadows are all there are. I'm not sure I'm here looking at the shadows. If I was a shadow, I'd be more real, or the degree to which I'm real is the degree to which I am one of those shadows. That's how radical. Hey, he's not saying, "Hey, let's get out of this cave and talk about the sun that's outside the cave." He's saying the shadows on the wall are the only thing I affirm as real, right? And then even to the point right now where he's denying his own existence as anything apart from the shadows. The perceptions of the shadows, the perceptions, which we could think of as the shadows, that's all that there is that would constitute a me. And if I'm not having one of those perceptions, I see no evidence of a self that is not experiencing something in that moment. And he grants that that might not be true of others. He says other people perform rationalist experiments and they look inside their consciousness and they discover, I think, therefore I am. And perhaps everything is shadows and deception. But I know one thing for sure, I'm real, and that type of thing. David Hume is like, no, 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 no. You don't know anything if it isn't ultimately traceable through the senses. And again, you might say, well, you could say that and then not follow through on the conclusions, right? You could say, hey, I've now defended science. The only type of knowledge is stuff that comes through the senses and is measurable. So let's go do science. But David Hume says, yep, the only kind of knowledge we could ever have is scientific, which means we can't have scientific knowledge. Why? Why? Because science requires us to imagine that we know that cause and effect exist or that the future will likely be like the past. And nothing through our senses has ever told us that has to be the case. We just presume it. So I've seen the sun come up a number of times. I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow morning. No idea. I mean, I have no reason to know, right? He might say, obviously, only a crazy person doesn't expect the sun to come up, but he doesn't see any way that we can know something. Like it's a crisis. David Hume is we can think of him, and in the second year, we're going to look so we're doing this 101 stuff here, but in the second year material, we go through the history of the philosophical conversation in a narrative way, right? So it's historical, chronological, but it's narrative. It's who's responding to who and what kind of a crisis is being created, and it flows. David Hume's role in that story is not to solve the problems. It's to it's to hold our faces right up against the problem and say, "This is the problem. This is unsolvable. This is how bad a situation we're in when it comes to knowing things the way I wanna know them." Now, so Kant comes after and tries to solve these problems, right? And we'll deal with that as in the other course. But, in a sense, that's his accomplishment. And the other thing to notice is that he's willing to do rationalist experiments, right? So he's being an empiricist, but he says, look, I looked inside my own mind. I'm not going to refuse to do that. You say, look inside your own mind and see what truths you find. And David Hume says, well, I see, I see a perception. Here's what David Hume says. David Hume says, the idea that I think, therefore I am follows is ridiculous. Thinking is occurring. That's all I know. I did the rationalist experiment that Descartes said we should do. I looked inside to say, what do I know for sure? And Descartes says, I think, therefore there's an I doing the thinking. I must be a thinking thing, at least whenever I posit that I'm thinking, because I can't doubt it without thinking, because doubting is a thinking thing. And David Hume says, I looked at the same thing and all I see is thinking occurring. I don't see an I that's doing it. Um, so so he takes us right back to the place that Descartes was trying to get out of. Descartes in this ocean of this black ocean of disorientation. Everything is doubtable. Everything is doubtable. I could doubt everything. And he says, like, does 2 + 2 = 4? I don't know. Maybe there's an all-powerful demon that's tricking me into doing my sums inaccurately. And he always tricks me to make the same error every time. And so I never see the difference. And like everything is doubtable. I don't even know that 2 + 3 = 5. What do I know for sure? He goes, well, I know that I'm doubting and I'm doubting and I'm doubting and I'm doubting and I'm doubting everything. But if I'm doubting, I must be a thinking thing that's doing the doubting because so I know that I must be. And David Hume it comes to that, and he doesn't say, "Well, I'm not gonna do that experiment. I'm just gonna assert empiricism and forget about experiments like that." David Hume says, "Sure, I'll do the experiment. Let's do it. I'm an empiricist. I think you can only know things through your senses, but let's see. What do I find is true about myself if I'm being honest and brave to look at it?" He goes, "All of the I is always attached to an experience, and the only amount of the I that I can recognize," this is his report, remember. He says, "This might not be true for other people, but for me, all I recognize about that I is the experience it's having." So there's just the experience. There's a series of perceptions. And if there's no perception, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of a me at that moment. And so, anyway, that's his thought process. It's pretty wild, right? It's, let's see. Maybe I could turn the light on that way. Why doesn't it want to turn on? I wonder if it's, hmm, exit and then open it again. Oh, shoot. Okay. I'm not going to get this light on, are we? Let's see. Yeah, it must be. Okay, here it is. Okay, hold on. I think I got it now. Yay. Okay. Sorry, I want to turn this on so we can read a little bit better. So let me close out of that. This should have just been plugged in, but there we go. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay. All right. It's getting darker outside. Okay. So, as for the other question, let's just keep reading and see what it is that he thinks, and maybe we'll get an answer to trying to figure out how he's understanding any of this. Okay, so he says what's commonly attended is a fiction. It's either of something invariable and uninterrupted, or of something mysterious and inexplicable, or at least with a propensity to such fictions. What I suffice to prove What will suffice to prove this hypothesis to the satisfaction of every fair inquirer is to show from daily experience and observation that the objects which are variable and interrupted, and yet are supposed to continue the same, are such only as consist of a succession of parts, connected together by resemblance, con- contiguity, or causation. For as such a succession answers evidently to our notion of diversity. I gotta just turn the audio on this off. I'm sorry. Okay, make it silent. Okay. For as such a succession answers evidently to our notion of diversity, it can only be by mistake we ascribe to it an identity. And as the relation of parts, which leads us into this mistake, is really nothing but a quality, which produces an association of ideas, and an easy transition of of the imagination from one to the other. It can only be from the resemblance which this act of the mind bears to that by which we contemplate one continued object that the error arises. Okay. He's saying it's a psychological or an intellectual error that we're making. Look, I've noticed that all of my understanding of myself is in terms of the perceptions that I am having at any moment. Let's say the experiences I seem to be going through. And then he says, okay, well, that's all we know about ourselves. But what are all of those experiences? They're all experiences of things that are made up of parts, that are complex, that are diverse and ever changing. So, what I do know about myself is that I'm always something different because everything I know is of my experience of something different, right? You can't step in the same river once, that type of thing, right? So, so that's what I know about myself so far. And then he's saying, okay, so I'm abstracting, right? I'm doing a mental I'm doing a mental trick. I don't mean like a fooling you trick, but I'm performing a mental operation on all of these things, and I'm abstracting out uh, something that seems simple and common between them all. But that's just the nature of abstraction, is finding what's common between it all. And then he says, and then we make the mistake of thinking that I am like that. I am the sort of thing that has the quality of abstraction because I have to perform the intellectual act of abstraction in order to extract anything from all of these varied experiences or reflect upon all these various experiences. So he thinks that's the whole reason why we have this illusion, this fiction, this fantasy of a self that is so different from everything we know that we experience, because all that's really happened is our brain applied something like that to all of these experiences. All we really know about ourselves are the individual experiences, and they're always diverse and they're always changing. So why do we think of ourselves as this unchanging thing? He goes, for the simple reason that in order to think about what's in common between all of these, right, that's, we call that our self, what's common with all these experiences, we do an abstraction. We abstract the commonality from all of them, and then we think of ourselves as something abstract. That's it. For him, he thinks that fully explains it. And we'll remember that he never denies that other people have a different experience of the self, but he says, this is, for my part, this is all I know of myself. Okay. So he's coming up with an explanation for why we make this mistake. Our chief business then must be to prove that all objects to which we ascribe identity, like oneness, identity, without observing their invariableness and uninterruptedness, are such as consist of a succession of related objects. Okay, so he's not even talking about the self. He's saying, look, uh, this is cool. This is the river once thing for sure, right? So I look at something and I have that immediate experience of the thing I'm looking at. I look away, I look at it again, and I'm having the immediate experience of the thing I'm looking at. But it's not the same thing. It says nothing in the world is like what you think you are. You're not like it, but neither is anything else. The object that you're looking at is not the same. It's in a different time. All of the molecules of it that constitute it have moved around. Its temperature might be different. It doesn't have one identity. But he says what we're doing is we're looking for all the commonalities between the two, abstracting them out, and we're calling that a oneness. That's an identity. It's the thing itself. But the thing itself is made up of moles and moles and moles of atoms, right? It's more than dozens, right? Lots and lots of atoms. So many you can hardly imagine. You can't imagine. And those things are vibrating and moving around. He's not talking in those terms, but the thing is also in a location relative to other things, to all other things, right? The block I look at is exactly 2.719685 meters from the stop sign 3 blocks down from my house. Something like that. Okay. But it's also a certain distance from the guy that's walking past that stop sign. That's the block I'm looking at. It's a thing that's a certain distance from the guy that's walking past the stop sign. I look at it again, it's at a different distance from the guy that's walking past the stop sign because he's been walking. It's not the same block anymore. What it's near is not the same. That's part of what makes it up. So we abstract out the commonalities and then we think that we have an identity because the act of abstraction is to find just a one thing, a group of qualities that are the same and invariable, and that and then we think that that is what we're looking at. What we're really looking at is something that's always changing. So we talked about the Haitian perspective, right? And in other words, he might not be wrong about this. This might be what the world looks like if you're in a specific position. If you're very close to chaos, you understand that part of making things up. This might be what things look like, right? Maybe Plato's trying to climb some Apollonian mountain, but David Hume is content to sit one third of the way down towards hell and say, I still see things, but the things I see, they're hardly there. They're hardly real. They certainly don't persist through time. They're not unchanging. Everything is changing. Elena, you unmuted. I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
Um, no, I'm sorry. It must have been
Oh,
my
okay.
mistake.
Oh, no, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure. I didn't wanna move on. Alright, so let's see here. In order in order to this, suppose is that where we left off? Okay. In order to this, suppose any mass of matter, of which the parts are contiguous and connected, to be placed before us. It is plain we must attribute a perfect identity to this mass, provided all the parts continue uninterruptedly and invariably the same. Whatever motion or change of place we may observe either in the whole or in any of the parts. But supposing some very small or inconsiderable part to be added to the mass or subtracted from it, though this absolutely destroys the identity of the whole, strictly speaking, yet, as we seldom think so accurately, we scruple not to pronounce a mass of matter the same where we find no so trivial an alteration. The passage of the thought from the object before the change to the object after it is so smooth and easy that we scarce perceive the transition and are apt to imagine that it is nothing but a continued survey of the same object. Okay, this is a cool way of putting it. I've got a block of Play Doh in front of me. This is my block. I'm going to call it Steve, right? La di da, I'm shaping it and playing with it. It's one thing. And I say it's one thing because look, I can move it and it's still here. Well, why say it's the same thing? If it's over here, it's not the same as what's over here. If I had two identical ones that were in those two places, you wouldn't call them the same thing. But I have just one and I move it around. And I abstract out that this is the same thing. He says, all right, add some more Play Doh to it, just a tiny little bit. Oh, now my thing is bigger. It's the same thing. Why do you think of it as the same thing? You made it a thing in your mind. You performed a mental act to conceptualize it as a thing. It's not the same thing anymore. It's the thing with a totally different number of molecules that make it up, right? But the transition between before and after is so smooth. He says, "Well, I've got the same thing. It's just slightly different." Well, what makes it the same thing? Why is it the same thing if I had originally just had 2, one with slightly more and one with slightly less, I wouldn't have called them the same thing, right? They're different. Here's little Steve and big Steve. This one has a tiny little bit more to him. So they're 2 different things. But in time, I just add a little bit to it and I say, "Oh, Steve added a little bit. Now he's bigger than he was before, but it's still the same thing." Our mind is just doing this, but it's not right. It's not logically consistent. It's not sticking to the type of rigorous thought that he wants to stick to in order to make pronouncements about what's true about the world. Okay. There's a very remarkable circumstance that attends this experiment, which is that though the change of any inconsiderable part in a mass of matter destroys the identity of the whole, yet we must measure the greatness of the part, not absolutely, but by its proportion to the whole. The addition or diminution of a mountain would not be sufficient to produce a diversity in a planet, though the change of a very few inches would be able to destroy the identity of some bodies. Okay, so he's saying, look, we're not being consistent, right? If I throw a pebble onto the side of a mountain, you don't say, "Oh my god, it's a new mountain. There was an old mountain here before, but that mountain died and now there's a new mountain with an extra pebble on it." No, you just say the mountain's there and somebody threw a pebble on it. But that pebble's part of the mountain now. Great, it's still just the mountain. He says, "Okay, well, what if you added 2/3 the mass of the mountain to it through dump trucks?" Well, now you might call it a different mountain. If you took away 2/3 of the mountain and blew it up with dynamite, and now this big mountain that was there is just this tiny little hill, would you say that the mountain is still there? It's just changed its size a little bit. No, you wouldn't. So there's a line that gets crossed, but it's not about how much is added or taken away because you could remove the entire mountain and you wouldn't say it's a new planet you're looking at, right? You could blow away an entire mountain and you wouldn't say, "Oh my god, that planet is gone and now there's a new planet." It's a lot like the old one, except there's that one mountain missing, right? You'd say, "No, it's the same planet. Someone blew up a mountain on it." But he's noticing that this is arbitrary. right? If I smashed the moon into a planet and it was only one third its size afterwards with a bunch of swirling disks and things around it, you might say it's a new planet. A new planet was born. This material and this material struck, and there's a new planet. It used to be Neptune. Now it's devastated post-apocalyptic Neptune or something. But you could call it a new planet, perhaps. Right? But you wouldn't do that if you blew up a mountain or added a crater, right? A meteor hits Neptune, there's a new crater. I don't know if Neptune's a gas planet or if it can have craters. It probably can. I don't spend enough time looking at that. We should look into it. But in any case, a meteor could strike a planet. There's a new crater on the planet. You don't say, "Oh my God, a new planet." The old planet didn't have a crater there, right? But why? Why? There's no reason for why a certain amount should and a certain amount shouldn't from Hume's perspective, right? Answering that question or figuring that out could be very worthwhile. But we might not even try to answer those questions or explore a way of answering Hume if there wasn't a guy like Hume to bring up these questions, right? There's something there's something psychotic but impressive about what he's doing, right? There's challenges there that most people would want to look away from, that he just wants to stare at without providing a solution. Okay. So, invariability, identity, oneness, he's denying it. He's saying everything's change. It's flux, it's change. There's ancient Greek philosophers, by the way, who obviously they conceptualized everything in exactly this way, right? There is a I will go so far as to say there's potentially a completely alternative scientific framework by which we could be looking at there's many, but this one happens to be one. It's very different from the way we look at it. Our science says there's little bits of hard stuff. Here's an atom, there's not an atom, here's a different atom. Let's measure them with our tape measure, let's measure them from outside and see what they do. There's another way of conceptualizing nature, which is everything is flux, everything is waves, everything is coming into and going out of, chain from one thing to another. And I will say there is no scientific reason to say that that's wrong, and there may be scientific insights that could be gained. I'm just going to stick to the scientific for a second. Scientific insights which could be gained. Oh, let me add you in here. I think we lost you. Are you on two devices? Should I remove one, or did you get kicked out and join in again? We're having technical issues. So sorry. It says thank you. So I added you in, but now there's 2 of you. Should I remove the old one, or are you on 2 devices now? We're having audio problems. Okay, cool. We're gonna leave it like that until we're sure what to do. Okay, so, um there's other ways of looking at it, and you may even have benefits from looking at it. There's certain experiments that don't seem comprehensible with the types of terminology and the conceptions we start with and presume when we're doing science today that might not even pose a queerness challenge, right? There's that physicist said the universe is queerer than we can suppose, perhaps. Well, maybe, or maybe you need to abandon some of the conceptualizations and realize that there's nothing philosophically wrong with these others, and perhaps they're useful lenses. Anyway, we won't get into that right now anymore. But he's noticing it's arbitrary. It's arbitrary what we say matters for changing something into something else. So uh, it will be impossible to account for this. But by reflecting that objects operate upon the mind and break or interrupt the continuity of its actions, not according to their real greatness, but according to their proportion to each other, and therefore, since this interruption makes an object cease to appear the same, it must be the uninterrupted progress of the thought which constitutes the imperfect identity. Let's read that again. Since this interruption makes an object cease to appear the same, it must be the uninterrupted progress of the thought which constitutes the imperfect identity. This may be confirmed by another phenomenon. A change in any considerable part of a body destroys its identity. But it is remarkable that where the change is produced gradually and insensibly, we are less apt to ascribe to it the same effect. The reason can plainly be no other. then that the mind, in following the successive changes of the body, feels an easy passage from the surveying its condition in one moment to the viewing of it in another, and in no particular time perceives any interruption in its actions, from which continued perception it ascribes a continued existence and identity of the object. All right, well, we don't have to sum that up in our own words again, right? That's a cool idea. um, if you go back 1.2 million years, the mountain that you're hiking in the Adirondacks was a lot bigger. If you went from how big it used to be, when all that erosion, how big it is now, the mountains in the Adirondacks used to be larger than the Himalayas, larger than Everest. They were huge. They were formed by the collision not of two continents, but three really huge mountains. Right now, they're fun to hike, and you don't need oxygen to get to the top, right? People hike them all the time. So if you took the old version of the mountain and then in an instant looked at the new version, you'd be like, "Oh, the old mountain's gone and this new baby relic old man version, what's left, I don't know, but it ain't the same mountain," right? I mean, it was a mountain like this, and this is a hiking trail. It's cool, but the mountain's gone, or at some point it's gone. Go another 2 million years into the future, the thing's gone, right? It's just a hill. You would say the mountain gradually eroded and was gone. But if you looked at it every single day, you would say it's the same mountain. Right? You wouldn't, it's hard to imagine. I mean, we could just do something in our time scale, perhaps would have been a better example. But if you happen to be looking at it every day you say it's the same mountain that it was yesterday, and there's no part of your mind that feels like, hey, just because you throw a pebble on it or take a pebble off, it's suddenly a different mountain. This seems arbitrary. And it seems like the mind is doing something to come to conceptualize it that way, and then we're observing the quality of that mind influenced concept, and then thinking that the part that comes from what the mind is doing is inherently true of the thing. And he said we can look at these big examples, but that's true of this object. This object right now is not the object I first called it this object when I first picked it up. It's in a completely different relative position to almost everything in the universe. um, it's molecules have all changed position billions of times. It's arbitrary. It's arbitrary that we say this thing is still this thing. Oh, where did I put this thing? Oh, I moved this thing over here. So it's all chaos, really. It's all shifting, really. You can have the moment of the experience of the thing, and you exist to the degree that you're perceiving it, but you're just like that. You're not a thing that doesn't stop existing. You're not a thing that's invariant and continuous. Okay. Whatever precaution we may use in introducing the changes gradually and making them proportional to the whole, it is certain that where the changes are at last observed to become considerable, we make a scruple of ascribing identity to such different objects. There is, however, another artifice by which we may induce the imagination to to advance a step further, and that is by producing a reference of the parts to each other and a combination to some common end or purpose. A ship, of which a considerable part has been changed by frequent reparations, is still considered as the same, nor does the difference of the materials hinder us from ascribing an identity to it. The common end in which the parts conspire is the same under all the variations and affords an easy transition of the imagination from one situation of the body to another. But this is still more remarkable when we add a symphony of parts to their common end. And suppose that they bear to each other the reciprocal relation of cause and effect in all their actions and operations. This is the case with all animals and vegetables, where not only the several parts have a reference to some general purpose, but also a mutual dependence on and connection with each other. The effect of so strong a relation is that though every one must allow that in a very few years both vegetables and animals endure a total change, yet we still attribute identity to them, while their form, size, and substance are entirely altered. An oak that grows from a small plant to a large tree is still the same oak, though there be not one particle of matter or figure of its parts the same. An infant becomes a man and is sometimes fat, sometimes lean, without any change in his identity. We may also consider the two following phenomena, which are remarkable in their kind. The first is that though we commonly be able to distinguish pretty exactly betwixt a numerical and specific identity, yet it sometimes happens that we confound them, and in our thinking and reasoning employ the one for the other. Thus, a man who hears a noise that is frequently interrupted and renewed says it is still the same noise, though it is evident the sounds have only a specific identity or resemblance. And there is nothing numerically the same but the cause which produced them. In like manner, it may be said, without breach of the propriety of language, that such a church, which was formerly of brick, fell to ruin, and that the parish rebuilt the same church of freestone, and according to modern architecture. Here, neither the form nor materials are the same, nor is there anything common to the two objects but their relation to the inhabitants of the parish. And yet, this alone is sufficient to make us denominate them the same. But we must observe that in these cases, the first object is in a manner annihilated before the second comes into existence, by which means we are never presented in any one point of time with the idea of difference and multiplicity, and for that reason are less scrupulous in calling them the same. All right, right? So says that's kind of an interesting example, right? The church burns to the ground, it's demolished. Then you rebuild it with totally different materials and a totally different style. Hey, we built our church back. It's the church we've always been going to. It's now been rebuilt. Okay. He says, "Well, if you built the second one next to the first one and then demolished the first one, you might be inclined to say it's a new church. We have a new church now. We have a new church building, right? We didn't rebuild the old one. We just have a new one. But if you demolish the first one and then even move it slightly and then rebuild it with different material and in a totally different architectural style, you're inclined to make the type of mistake he's trying to force us to admit is a mistake, recognize as a mistake when thinking about ourselves and anything else, that it's the same church. Its relationship to the parishioners is what's the same, and that's enough for us to call it the same church, as long as they're not existing in a different place at the same time. We our minds arbitrarily do that, right? It's fine that we do that, but he's not going to call that the truth of the building. It existed permanently and it is an identity or something like that, but we still denominate it that way. Okay. Secondly, we may remark that though in a succession of related objects, it be in a manner requisite that the change of parts be not sudden or entire in order to preserve the identity, yet where the objects are in their nature changeable and inconsistent, we admit of a more sudden transition than would otherwise be consistent with that relation. Thus, as the nature of a river consists in the motion and change of parts, though in less than 4 and 20 hours, these be totally altered, this hinders not the river from continuing the same during several ages. What is natural and essential to anything is, in a manner, expected, and what is expected makes less impression and appears of less moment than what is unusual and extraordinary. A considerable change in the former kind seems really less to the imagination than the most trivial alteration of the latter, and by breaking less, the continuity of the thought has less influence in destroying the identity. So he's calling this identity idea kind of a psychological phenomenon. He's saying you can't really trace it to the physical measurable experience, but I'm noticing that these are the types of things we do. And if you notice that we're calling the same something that's very different the same, maybe we should take that back and realize that other things that we don't immediately see are not the same are also not the same for the exact same reasons that we've just been it's convenient in our minds to abstract a sameness to it and then to posit that there's an identity there. But it's our abstraction that creates the illusion of the identity. There's nothing you can measure or observe about the parts that's the same, right? So, I like his example here because a meandering river, as everybody probably knows, right? It meanders. It goes around in a flood bed, and so once a year or every once in a while, it might flood, and then you've got this big flat area with a lot of deposited stuff, and usually some hills on the side. It's got its place that it makes a path, but it curves and curves and curves and curves. Oh, there we go. It curves and curves and curves, and the outside part cuts away fast, and it's pulling the outside part of a curve is cutting and cutting and cutting into the bank. It's not like there's sand and stuff there, it just cuts and it's steep. But on the slow side curve, this river's carrying a lot of dirt. And when you're going slower, you can't carry the dirt. You can't carry such heavy objects. So it deposits and deposits and deposits. And so you get the buildup and the buildup and the buildup of a bank on one side and a cutting edge on the other side, and then it shoots in the other direction. You get a cutting edge over here and a big deposit bank on the other side. Well, what happens is it curves and it curves faster and faster until it kind of curves up against itself, and then this oxbow lake gets created because what happens is it curves until the two ends of the river meet, and then as soon as they meet, the water can just flow this way instead of going on that whole long curve, and so it starts flowing this way, and you get this little oxbow lake in the floodbed of this river. And he said, "Well, that can happen in a day." Right? It's just been shaping and shaping and changing its shape, and then finally it touches itself, and you're much lower altitude further down the river. So if you're 18 yards down the river, you know, and then you're suddenly touching 18 yards up the river, well, that water's going to flow down that way. It's not going to take the longer path anymore because you've been gradually going down in elevation that whole time. Obviously, you're going to just shoot straight, um, jump part of the path. But you can watch it happen. You can go out there and observe till sunset the river and see it curving, and then you go to bed and you come out in the morning and all of a sudden it's not flowing that way. There's a little lake there and now it's flowing a different direction. But you have no problem saying it's the same river. If you watch that river for a year, it's going to be over here, then it's going to be over here. It's going to move to the right and to the left side, or the east and the west ridges of this flood bed between the place that it's not digging down, and it's not in the same location even throughout a year. And even in a day, you can see it change its course, and yet you still call it the same river. It's an operation of our imagination. We now proceed to explain the nature of personal identity, which has become so great a question in philosophy, especially of late years in England, where all the abstruser sciences are studied with a peculiar ardor and application. And here it is evident the same method of reasoning must be continued, which has so successfully explained the identity of plants and animals and ships and houses, and of all compounded and changeable productions, either of art or nature. The identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one, and of a like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetable and animal bodies. It cannot, therefore, have a different origin, but must proceed from a like operation of the imagination upon like objects. But lest this argument should not convince the reader, though in my opinion perfectly decisive, let him weigh the following reasoning, which is still closer and more immediate. It is evident that the identity which we attribute to the human mind, however perfect we may imagine it to be, is not able to run the several different perceptions into one and make them lose their characters of distinction and difference, which are essential to them. It is still true that every distinct perception which enters into the composition of the mind is a distinct existence and is different and distinguishable and separable from every other perception, either contemporary or successive. But as notwithstanding this distinction and separability, we suppose the whole train of perceptions to be united by identity, a question naturally arises concerning this relation of identity, whether it be something that really binds our several perceptions together, or only associates their ideas in the imagination. That is, in other words, whether in pronouncing concerning concerning the identity of a person, we observe some real bond among his perceptions or only feel one among the ideas we form of them. This is exactly the same, right? He's saying we're imagining something in the identity of other objects. We're imagining something in our identity. What's causing this imagination? A mental act of abstraction, perhaps, that we're doing to a set of very different and constantly changing things. We're doing the same thing to all of our perceptions. We're abstracting something out and then saying, the nature of it is quite abstract, this self of mine that's having all these experiences. He says, you have no immediate experience of the self that does the experiencing. All you have are the experiences. You're calling that evidence of a self. Well, what kind of a self? All of the experiences are different. They're continually changing and variable and popping in and going out of existence. That's the only evidence you have of yourself. Why is yourself unchanging, having all these experiences? And furthermore, you're looking at the commonality or an abstraction of all these perceptions, and then your imagination thinks that there's something abstract about you. There's something permanent about you because you've looked for the things that don't change and you've abstracted them out. But you've had no direct experience of yourself. Yourself is the thing having the experiences, is what you would say, but all I see of that self are the experiences. So, experiences happen. That's all we know. We don't know that there's a self having these experiences. Um,
May I ask something? Something?
please, please.
Would he accept an entire landscape of as inner structure of a human being, meaning a mental plane, emotional world, however, however it be illustrated um, by each one? Maybe someone considers his feels or sees his emotional world, so to say, to a visualization of his internal world as a lake, another as an ocean, as a pond, as a whatever. His subconscious to be a cave, a door to an abyss, flying up above, reaching the universe, etc. So, would Hume accept an entire landscape for a human being as an internal world, but he does not accept the consciousness the that runs the entire mechanism, or the that these are facets and elements of an entity? Like we say, we are a person, a human being. I have a mind, the organs, the skeleton, etc. He never correlates and sees or accepts the as above so below, meaning he is a human being with parts. It is a body, it has organs. There is something that connects and moves the whole the whole body, regardless of limb. Doesn't he correlate to an internal world that are the organs, so to say, of the being, the entity, the being, and thus in absolute correlation to the ultimatum of correspondence, there is an entity that runs the system or has the landscape and as facets, as the cogwheels.
Okay, right. So that's awesome. Two ideas that you put forward. The first one is a landscape. What about a landscape of very, very different types of experiences? And we could conceptualize some as lake-like and some as mountain-like or whatever. He says, if you're being honest and you really want to know something, that's all you are, but you can't even group them into singular things. There's the molecule and then the other molecule in the lake. That's what you really know. You don't know that it comes together as a lake, but when you perform the mental process of grouping them together by finding an abstract commonality between them so that these ideas or experiences or perceptions are lake-like, you think that there's a you that's lake-like. But really what you have is a landscape of perceptions and nothing else. Perfectly pixelated down as far as you can possibly go. Those are the things you actually know. You can do this mental process of grouping things together, and if you group all of it together, you have the landscape, and you can conceptualize yourself as the landscape of all these things. But you added that to the story. That was a mental imaginative process you went through. What you knew were just the all of the individual things that you collected, all of those individual perceptions. That's the only thing you have a right to say you know. So that's the first thing. And the second thing was contained a little bit within it. He says this process that makes you think you know that there's a landscape is just the mental process of collecting and abstracting what allows the things to be collected. That abstraction process, that whatever mental process you are applying to what you know, you're adding something to it there. It's not coming from the truth about the world. Remember, he only recognizes truth that you can know, things you can know as stuff that comes to you ultimately empirically. So you doing something with your mind and it being linked to an imaginative inclination that's similar to everybody else's, it doesn't count as knowledge. It doesn't count as something you've discovered to him that you report to him about what's true about yourself or the world. It's just it's true that your mind does that, but it's not true of the world, right? So let's push on this a little bit here. Um, if there were no human beings on the planet, but everything else in the biosphere was the same, just magically. I know there wouldn't be the same, it'd be very different, but let's say it's the same. Magically, we just poof, magic wand, no human consciousness anymore. But we left a Jeep on the side of a road. Is it a is it a vehicle anymore? Is it a transportation machine for bipeds? Does it have 4 wheels? Everything else that comes across it treats it like a rock, makes use of it like a rock. It's kind of a weird looking rock, but is there such a thing as a vehicle if there isn't human consciousness, human perspective giving it its meaning? We might go further and say, if we had a conversation about the purpose and meaning and of grass and the concept of grass, we know there's blades of grass and there's qualities to each blade that we might measure empirically. But grass, what's its point? Well, if let's say we're in a room with 12 people and one of them is a Darwinian, and he said, "Well, what's the point of grass?" Well, the point of grass is to create flowers so that you can reproduce and make more grass. And then you talk to a farmer or a geologist, you say, "What's the point of grass?" Well, the point of grass is to have a tendril root system that helps to slow very dramatically the erosion process of things so that the ground mostly stays the same rather than rapidly eroding and sort of like just falling into low places, but you've got more consistency there. And then we talk to a poet and you say, "Well, what's the point of grass?" Well, so that I can quote the amber waves of grain and inspire people with the language that I'm using, because we all know what Mother Earth means, and the quality of the grass is the poetic quality of it allows me to talk about the bed of of lounging or whatever. Okay, and then we talk to an ecological biologist say, "Well, the point of grass is to take, photo is to take electromagnetic radiation from the sun and absorb it to take the energy of that and the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and a few other minerals maybe that it comes across and some water to create sugar molecules that are the basis of the entire food pyramid so that other grass-eating creatures can feed off of it and then predators can feed off of them, and that's the role that grass is playing and that's its purpose, right? We could come up with story after story after story about the purpose of grass. But what if there's no people on the planet? Does the grass have a purpose? It's still doing those things, I guess, right? But adding purpose to it is purposeful creatures. Purposeful creatures are in the world determining or discovering or inventing. I'll leave that as an open question right now. But at least let's say discovering. I like that. Let's say discovering the purposes. So do they have any purposes? What if there's no creatures that see color? Is the grass green? There's nothing about the electromagnetic radiation between 330 and 396 nanometers that's green. You can study it scientifically forever, you're not gonna find it, but it is green. So, what w what we're popping up here to consider is something to prime our intuition that consciousness plays a role in the existence of things. If the only conscious creatures like ourselves were embodied in neutrinos, the Earth would not be impenetrable. We would pass right through it. It would be flat. The sphere of the Earth is true because there are creatures with our consciousness in our perspective to observe it that way. And what David Hume is doing is trying to not allow consciousness to play any sort of a role in what it is that he will affirm is true. And you take out that consciousness, you really lose an awful lot. He's noticed that you lose the idea that this thing is the same right now as it was when I first just picked it up. So it's not the same thing. There is no thingness of anything. That goes away. Now, somebody might say, "Oh my God, nothing is real," right? And David Hume might be uh, trying to admirably face that fact straight on and say, "Hey, you know, you're living in an ocean of chaos and there's nothing real except fantastic illusions. There's nothing that could make anything habitable or make it make sense." But that's not the only conclusion that one could come from this, or that could come from examining these things. There's all sorts of philosophical approaches which swallow whole his observations, but say, yeah, consciousness is fundamental to being. The logos is the language usage. Logos is at the foundations of things being comprehensible and real. And that doesn't make them less real. It makes you more significant than you thought you were, perhaps. It might be the spark of the divine that the ancient poets were talking about, that there's a creative and a sustaining of being element to consciousness. And that doesn't mean there's not a world outside yourself. The thing's still real, but what makes it what it is to us is partly the to us part. It's partly the fact that we are what we are. And again, that might not seem satisfying to people who feel like they're falling into Descartes' ocean of incomprehensibility and his before he finds the "I think therefore I am" thing, which David Hume is saying, I thinking is occurring. I still don't know if there's an I doing the thinking," and he's denying that that's the case. But if you're saying, "Oh my God, it's all not real. It's just one crazy nightmare or something, and we're just making it up or something." Well, the relationship between you and the things is only being looked at from one side. A radical embrace of Darwinism is that you are the product of what fits in well with the rest of the cosmos. Right. So if there's this mutual dependency on the two, we won't go any further with this, but there's this is just one philosophical camp that radically embraced um, a few different concepts, but completely swallowed whole uh, the limits of uh, what we can know that Hume is pointing out. And remember, Socrates says, "Well, we can't know anything." Well, it's not that different from what David Hume is exploring here, right? Socrates went through all of the subjects that he rejected as not going to get him to truth, and they included mathematics. Okay, hold on. Frickin' people calling. Okay. Just had to mute it because it still vibrates. I don't understand technology well enough. Okay, so Socrates rejected all of physics and all of these different subjects, saying, "Look, I already figured out that they're not going to get you to something like what I want." And he said, "The only subject worth considering is ethics." Well, ethics he's conceptualizing, I think properly, as characterological, as subjective, as who we are as people actively moving from place to place in the world, and in Socrates' perspective, in a cosmic journey of trying to get at the light and the truth and the hope and beauty qua beauty, and to do it relationally as it's complete opposite emphasis of what matters. Instead of trying to extract away the subjective, it's all the subject, right? I don't mean relativistically the term subjective. I mean the character and the subject is fundamentally important to what it is that he wants to know. But even that thing, he says, I can't really know that until maybe after death. What I can do is get close to it. David Hume is sitting far away from where Socrates wants to go, and he's saying, "Look, you can't know it. Let's just be honest that we can't really know anything." Uh, that might be an unfair summation. Let me take that back for a quick second. David Hume wants us to be honest about, let's say this. David Hume wants to identify things that we think without the type of justification that would allow us to say we really know it, and then abandon talking about those things. It's leaving us with very little to talk about, maybe, right? We don't even know that we exist as identities. In fact, we have no reason to say we do. And so he'll just flat out deny that we do. And we have no reason to think that this is a thing. It's not a thing. Right in the moment I'm perceiving it, the perception is happening. But the next moment and in the next perception is qualitatively different. It's always changing. This is an ever changing. This is this is me identifying one perceptive moment in a string of perceptive moments that are always different. I don't like to notice that they're different, so I like to abstract out the similarities, and then I call that abstraction in my imagination the thing, but I haven't perceived that. That isn't something I've gotten from my perception. So what I've gotten is a series of a river constantly changing. Um, so I'm sorry to go so long. I'm not trying to argue that he's right or that he's wrong. I'm trying to say that if somebody rejects what he's saying because they think that the conclusion is unwanted to them, that's not good enough. We have to face what he's saying and see what the consequences of it are and whether or not it can be incorporated into our perspective. Uh, and I don't think we're forced to be led to his conclusions that there is no I, right? I don't think that. But whatever sense of self we have and whatever sense of persistent and unchanging thingness that might be, it should certainly be altered and qualified and shaped by um ex- experience to the hammering criticism that he's trying to give to that idea, right? We can at least benefit from the hell out of that because David Hume is a he's a bizarre character in this story. All right, I won't keep going on. Would you like to? I'm trying to get us through as much of this as we can because the first time we did the mind body thing, we just went through each one in a day, and this is our second day of dealing with just David Hume, and I really love it. I'm really glad that we're doing it this in depth, and that we're getting more out of it. And I think it has to do with your interest in it that's allowing us to do that. But what we might need to do is pause and say, look, we're not going to get to the end of what he concludes until next time. Or actually, yeah, we started early, right? I forgot. Hold on a second. Okay, it's time for a break. So go ahead.
Before we go to a break, please tell me uh, what part of the essay we're at, because I need to find the essay and pinpoint the syllogism within which I know that I need to find where I miss his mind, the sequence to his syllogism, but I need to read
Yes,
that.
fantastic. So if you have the hardcover book, it's of the third edition of the one we're going through. It's page 189, and we just finished the second full paragraph. If you don't, there aren't subsection titles here, but it is. Hey, Norm, leave me alone a minute. I've got to turn the page. I know you just want love. All right. You make things more difficult. It is the 16th paragraph that we're about to start when we come back from the break in the essay on David Hume, which is the first full essay in the section, The Mind Body Problem. Does that help?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay, good. So what we're going to do is we are going to end the live stream and we're going to start a second one because on Mondays I forgot we're going to do extra long sessions and we're gonna get through it that way. So we're gonna be doing extra long on Monday and then probably regular time on Wednesday, starting at the same time. That's our new calendar. Sorry it took me so long, forgot about it, but that's what we're doing. And so we're gonna end this live stream, take a break. We'll come back with part 2 for today, and in that, we will finish David Hume, which I know I said when we started that this was my least favorite essay in this entire section, but, I'm getting a lot more out of it going through it with you, so I'm really glad we're doing this a second time, and I think it might have been fortuitous that I forgot to record the first time we went through this with the other class. So, I'm thrilled by that. We're gonna end it. We'll see y'all later, and, we'll be back in probably, let's say 20 minutes.